Hey, can I be a king?
No.
Please?
No.
Please?
No.
Please?
No.
Please?
No.
Please? Sule! Story Deck is a crazy new concept full of crazy stories from the Stormlight Archive. This trading card game meets novelettes was introduced to the world back at 2024's Dragonsteel Nexus convention. Attendees could earn packs that would contain a random assortment of cards from 3 different stories. Each story had 54 unique cards, and if you collected them all, you would have exclusive access to these new canon stories. If you want a more detailed breakdown for how all this works, you should check out Cosmic Horizon's great video about the story decks here. Today I'm going to summarize the story King Lopen, First of Elokhar. We'll talk about any cool connections to the larger plot of the Stormlight Archive and highlight any new lore that we may see along the way. In addition to spoilers for King Lopen, there will also be minor spoilers for the Stormlight Archive as we make some connections. Please subscribe and share this video if you enjoy it. We have a lot to go over today, so let's get going. Hey all, a quick but important disclaimer here. Brandon has stated to the public that he wants to maintain the fun of Story Deck for the first year or so of its release, and he's asked that people not share the full text of the stories to the public until Dragonsteel does themselves. We hear this and we want to honor it, but we also recognize that many people just can't afford to chase these cards down at cons or buy them online. So to give everyone a chance at being part of the fun, we're doing these summary videos on each of the stories. These are not replacements for the actual written works, but we do share some fun connections we've made, and we give a pretty comprehensive summary of the plots. If you still want to experience Story Deck the way it was intended, then click off of here and enjoy collecting your story. Alright, back to the video. The opening of this story is from King Elokhar's point of view. We find Elokhar alive, yet in pain, in the Alethi war camps. He's specifically in the Lopen's family home in Little Herdaz. He's currently healing from his wounds after barely surviving the assassination attempt by Graves and Moash in the final act of Words of Radiance. Before flying off to save Dalinar and co, Kaladin had hit him here with the Lopen, worrying that there may be more assassins sent to finish the job. As far as Elokhar knew, the forces loyal to Dalinar were still on campaign against the listeners, though we know that they were probably in Urithiru by the time this story takes place. The threat to the king's life was very real still, but Elokhar's largest threat right now was right in front of him, Issa Milana, or Issa, the Lopen's mother. Issa had been taking care of the king for a few days at this point, and they had taken many steps to protect Elokhar from prying eyes, namely dressing him up in a palidma, a Herdazian girl's coming-of-age dress, and keeping him indoors. None of this was helping the king's mood much. See, Elokhar is very troubled by the fact that he hadn't died. At this point in the story, the king had been spiraling, thinking himself unfit to rule. Elokhar questions why his life was worth sparing, since his more capable sister didn't even survive her own assassination attempt. His mood worsens further when he looks at the mirror in his room and sees shadows that have been following him. We now know these to be cryptics that were curious about bonding with him while having no self-awareness of their cosmic horror appearance. Elokhar is still paranoid by these creatures, but he starts to understand that they likely would have ended him by now if that was their goal, if they're even real. After finishing dressing the king and placing his wig, Issa informs him that it's time to make supales, a traditional Herdazian dish to celebrate the reign's ending. As they leave his room, there's a great commotion outside. The other POV in this book is none other than, you guessed it, the Lopen. We see him outside of his mother's home with about 30 of his cousins. They had all gathered to bring him their Stormlight, and he needed it too. The Lopen was ready to bring back his arm and become a 2-armed Herdazian again. With all of their Stormlight inhaled, Lopen forced the light through the nub of his arm. His body remembered the arm and healed back the whole thing, fingers and all. The cousins, Huyo included, are amazed at the spectacle. Glory Spren appear around the Lopen, and he celebrates his new arm by making his first dual-armed rude gesture to Huyo since his accident. He gives his cousin chicken looks to the sky, and the Glory Spren are immediately replaced by Huyo's Disgust Spren. I think that would look something like... Huyo mentions to Lopen that there are enemy soldiers closing in on Elokhar's hideout. Luckily, the Lopen has a plan. The Lopen heads into the home and finds Elokhar making supales with his mother. The 2-armed Herdazian finds this sight amusing as the king of Elokhar struggles to fold a piece of dough. The Lopen goes on to ponder what it would be like to be a king. On page 2, Lopen greets his mother and shows her his newly grown arm. Issa is obviously overjoyed by this, and the Lopen finally remembers his mama telling him not to mope back when he lost his arm. After all Herdazian women live as 1-armed Herdazians because of their restricted safe hands. Issa sends the Lopen to help Elokhar with the supales, and the king is annoyed at hearing his name in conversation while not being able to speak Herdazian. Mama scolds him, telling him to learn Herdazian, as his kingdom speaks more than one language. As Lopen starts to teach Elokhar how to make supales, showing off with one hand, the door to the home bursts open. Without a thought, Lopen grabs his spear, thrusting it towards the strange figure in the door. That looks a lot like Huyo. Fortunately, Lopen isn't practiced with the other arm and misses Huyo outright, even hurting his own wrist in the process. Elokhar is not impressed with this exchange. He questions the safety he has with guards guards as incompetent as the Lopen. But Lopen doesn't take this to heart. He knows that the king will warm up to him, obviously. Huyo had come to warn Lopen of the soldiers nearby and see what the brilliant plan was. The soldiers approaching are not enemy soldiers, mind you, so Elokhar tells the group to let them find him. Issa jumps in and reminds Elokhar that even though he's a king, she is the ruler of this household, and he better sit his butt down and do as he's told. The Lopen concurs and reminds the king that they are not to trust anybody. Stormbless's orders. As Elokhar tries to reconcile why Kaladin would have ever entrusted his life to such a buffoon, Issa chimes in with a problem. Issa has a predicament. She has taken a vow of honesty. If anybody asks for information on Elokhar, she cannot lie. This is a religious oath and one that she won't break even for the king of Alethkar. Elokhar is baffled at this, and then the Lopen reveals his master plan. For Elokhar to remain hidden and for his mother to remain truthful, Elokhar must abdicate the throne to him. That went over as well as you'd think it would. As the laughter settles down, Lopen actually explains his plan. If he were to take the king's place for a short time, anyone can send soldiers to the Lopen instead of revealing Elokhar's secret. Issa chimes in, sharing that this is the only way she can maintain the truth and keep the king safe. Laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, and with a small sense of hopelessness, Elokhar agrees, naming the Lopen King Lopen, first of Alethkar. Elokhar was still spiraling a bit at this point. He was sad to have a reminder of his failure. He had just named a Dark Eyes the king, though it did bring him some joy to say all hail King Lopen. Through his surges of emotion, the king admits to himself the hard truth. All he really wants to do is make Dalinar proud. On page 3, after Elokhar finishes his self-loathing, we return to King Lopen's POV. After admiring his new bloodstained robes, the new king names Huyo the king's wit. This is an unremarkable event as King Lopen quickly redacts it due to Huyo's inability to be funny. There is an interesting lore update though. Huyo manifests a new spren when appointed this title. Angst spren. Someone call Axes! After firing Huyo, Lopen names his new arm the king's wit. I'm sure there's an inappropriate joke here somewhere. And we now have a new named character. Wit, because that's not confusing. Lopen commands Wit to never again leave his side, and he gives his arm clothing appropriate of his new station, Huyo's sock. Back with Elokhar, we find him still failing to roll the supales, and Issa takes away his job. Instead, he now has to vigorously mix the filling. He uses a bowl, which he quickly figures out is the skull of a large kremling. Here we learn the name of a new Rosharan species, Thrublings. These kremlings are scared of everything, so they curl up into a ball when the high storm comes and simply die after being thrashed about by the winds. As the former king gets frustrated at his lack of supale making skills, Issa teaches Elokhar the value in practice, patience, and listening. Elokhar attempts to relate this advice to being the king, but struggles to understand how to implement it. Then a knock comes at the door. Mama tells Elokhar to keep his head down and avoid letting his light eyes be seen. Before Issa can get to the door though, it opens. On page 4, Danlan is introduced to the story. If you remember from The Way of Kings, she was a scribe in Dalinar's army who formerly dated Adolin. Danlan was the one who controlled the Spanreed when Dalinar was talking to Yasna about the Voidbringers. She was also present at Kaladin's meeting with Graves and Moesh about the plot to assassinate Elokhar. So yeah, we already know she's up to no good. Unfortunately, Elokhar and Issa don't know this information. The former king almost drops his cover to go with Danlan, but something holds him back. There's a feeling of security in Issa's home and an understanding that Kaladin's orders were for his own good. Issa carefully words her reply, sending the soldiers in the direction of the king. Lopen. They notice Elokhar but don't recognize him, and Issa covers for the king. She calls him her cousin and says he's temporarily visiting. This is not technically a lie because the Herdazians are very loose with their definition of cousin, and Elokhar helping Issa makes him a cousin in her eyes. After inviting Danlan and the rest inside to help make supales, the soldiers leave without a goodbye. Rude. Back with Lopen. He's already using his new station to great effect. He's attempting to woo Meli, his favorite Chowdistan worker, with his new title and sock puppet arm. A lot of the rest of this story involves the Lopen having conversations with Wit, but we're not going to cover it. None of it's too relevant, and you can enjoy it yourself by reading the full story. King Lopen goes on to show off his new radiant powers. He fuses his hand to a vase full of spheres accidentally, and as he tries to remove it, Huyo and the Lopen see soldiers enter the market. King Lopen recognizes Danlan, and the soldiers recognize Elokhar's clothing. The two flee from Meli's stand after shattering her vase. Very impressive, Gancho. Back to Elokhar. Him and Issa are still making supales, and the former king of Alethkar is finally starting to relax. Elokhar begins to open up about his struggles with listening to people, and he reflects on how easily he is manipulated by the other high princes. Issa challenges Elokhar's worries about his decisions getting people killed, asking if he cares more for the people or for his own image. On page 5, Elokhar asks for advice. He wants to know who to trust when surrounded by manipulative people. Issa tells him to seek the wisdom of those with experience. He should seek the advice from his cousins, which are essentially just people you can count on. Elokhar considers Dalinar when thinking about who might qualify as cousin in his life. We get to see some serious insecurity in the former king, as he reflects about his inability to get Dalinar to listen to him. Issa then rolls a perfect supale and names it Cousin Elokhar. Elokhar rolls his best supale yet and names it the Bridgeman Stormblessed.
Aww.
Back to King Lopen. The king, Huyo, and Wit hide behind an empty stall. Yes, this is all canon. Lopen is having an identity crisis as he struggles to adjust to being a two-armed Herdazian. As the soldiers approach, Huyo makes a break for it, leaving King Lopen alone with his sock hand Wit. After a brief deliberation, King Lopen and Wit eventually decide to run, but get spotted as they move between booths. The guards chase them down, and in a frantic scene, we get to see the king's Wit use Lopen's Stormlight to paint the ground, trapping the guards and giving him room to run to the center of the plaza. This starts a small montage of the king taking Stormlight out of Vendor Sphere jars and the Wit sticking guards to the ground. Again, this is all canon. When Lopen and Wit make it to the center of the plaza, they find a large pole. Lopen climbs to the top with his non-Wit hand, since this is easier for him than using two hands still. Wit yells at the king that it would be easier if he used both hands, but again, the Lopen is having some identity issues. After some self-reflection, Lopen realizes he doesn't need to be so many different things. He doesn't need to be the Lopen, a Radiant, a two-armed Herdazian, the king, and the king's Wit. After all, this might be too much awesomeness for one person. He finally decides to use his new arm, Wit, to help. He's able to climb higher until he runs out of Stormlight. On page 6, Lopen awakes from his fall, healing from his injuries with some Stormlight. He is face down in the creme at this point. Huyo had fed him Stormlight to heal him and helps him back up to his feet. Just as he gets his bearings, King Lopen is confronted by some guards in Danlan. She is outraged to discover the mangy Herdazian had duped her, and then King Lopen and Wit stick her to the ground. Back to Elokhar. The former king is finally cooking the sapales. While looking at his reflection in the pot, the familiar shadowy figures appear. His attention is caught by one with a lacy design for a head. We can gather this to be Design, the cryptic that eventually forms a bond with the former king's Wit, Hoyd. King Lopen then enters the home along with Huyo and immediately gives the title of king back to Elokhar. The former King Lopen explains that Danlan is on their tail and she is angry. King Elokhar is angered by this information and begins to rip into the Lopen before Issa reminds him to listen instead of speak. When the former king's Wit explains the situation, Elokhar is taken aback by the insanity of Lopen speaking to him with a sock puppet. Danlan finally arrives with her retinue and Elokhar agrees to let them into the home. Elokhar commands Danlan to stand down and she has no choice but to listen. Understanding that Elokhar feels threatened, she closes the door to the home, leaving the guards outside. The king tells her that he will be staying with the Herdazians until Stormblessed himself arrives to escort him home. Danlan once again displays her low character by being disgusted that the king would want to stay with dark-eyed Herdazians. However, Elokhar takes the hand of Issa and explains that these Herdazians are his cousins. Danlan then pulls a dagger on Elokhar and stabs at him with a flash. The Lopen rushes to stop her by throwing his new hand, that being the former king's Wit, in the dagger's path. In a moment of beautiful sacrifice, Wit took the dagger for Elokhar. Danlan decides against making another attempt at Elokhar after seeing the Lopen glowing with Stormlight. She escapes out a window and Elokhar orders the soldiers to chase her down. They are rightfully confused as they see their king dressed in a polydma. Elokhar removes his wig and declares himself as the king, and the guards finally listen, giving chase to Danlan. As the dust settles, the Lopen says a final goodbye to Wit as he passes away. Former King Lopen offers Huyo's sock back to him, and the story concludes. And that's the end. Yeah, this was an interesting story to say the least. No real major revelations, just some quality insight into the minds of Elokhar and the Lopen. We received some new Herdazian lore, and we learned the names of a new Kremling, Thrublings, and we even learned of a new type of Spren, Angstspren. These stories are super cute, and collecting them was a really fun time. Make sure to subscribe for more weekly Cosmere content. See you next time, Gansho. Kolo?